Chapter 1. The moment before the storm. Liam had always loved the sea. It was his rhythm, his lullaby, the place where the horizon stretched as far as the mind could dream. Every Sunday, he would drive to the pier, the wind tangling his hair, the gulls calling, and he would sit on the worn wooden planks and think about what tomorrow might bring. Evelyn, on the other hand, had grown up in a small town where the river ran through the town square and the only sound of music was the church bell. She was a teacher, a lover of books, and an earnest dreamer. She would walk past the pier each week, carrying a stack of new novels, and glance at Liam, who never seemed to notice her. They were strangers in a world where strangers were often a comfort, not a threat. The day that would change everything was a rain-drenched Tuesday. The clouds hung low, a silver grey that matched Liam's mood. He had just finished a day of tutoring his niece, her eyes bright with questions about the stars. Evelyn was late for a school meeting, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her thoughts were on the upcoming semester's curriculum. They met at the pier's edge where the sea met the sky. Liam had been waiting, fingers trembling on the railing. When Evelyn appeared, she looked surprised, a smile spreading across her face. "You are early," she said, her voice hushed, as if the sound might rattle something fragile. "I could have come a half-hour sooner," Liam replied, his tone casual. He lifted the railing, inviting her over. "You always bring your books. They're like little islands of calm." Evelyn laughed, and that laughter was a spark in a dark room. She found her footing, and as she walked up to him, their eyes met. "It's a lovely day for a conversation," she said, and the world narrowed to just that moment, the water below whispering stories of ages past. They started to talk about simple things, Liam's love for the ocean and Evelyn's passion for teaching. As the rain began to fall, they found an umbrella to share, their conversation drifting from the trivial to the profound. The first thread of their story was woven then, quiet and unremarkable, a seed tucked between the waves and the river's bend. But nothing lasts forever. Chapter 2. The collision. At the end of the day, as they walked back to the parking lot, their conversation was interrupted by a screech. A delivery truck, heavy and fast, had lost control on the slick road. Its wheels spun, its metal frame groaned, and in a heart-stopping instant, it collided with Liam's car. Evelyn's heart stopped for a heartbeat. The world seemed to tilt, and a cold darkness pressed against her vision. She stared at the twisted metal, the smoke curling up from the engine, and then at Liam, his face contorted in pain. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, but her voice sounded distant. The world seemed to pause. The ambulance's siren wove its way through the fog of disbelief. The driver's eyes were glassy, the road ahead blurred. When the emergency crew arrived, the scene was a tapestry of twisted steel and blood. Liam was found lying in the gutter, a pulse that trembled against his chest. The paramedics worked quickly, but the injury was severe, a broken back, a life that might be ending or beginning. They took him to the hospital, the night stretching endlessly. Evelyn was in the parking lot, her fingers clutching the back of her chair, her eyes never leaving Liam's battered body. She heard the sirens, the whir of machines, the voices of strangers, and her own thoughts fell into a void. The ocean had always been a place of calm for Liam. Now it was a memory, an echo. When Liam was taken away, Evelyn felt the world tilt. She sat in the waiting room for hours, the fluorescent lights flickering like stars in a storm. She prayed for a miracle, for a story that would end in hope. The hours stretched into days, and the silence in the hospital corridor was a harsh, unyielding presence. Chapter 3. The long recovery. Liam's world changed in a blink. In the days that followed, he was confined to a bed, his back a mosaic of pain. He felt his body as a prison, the bed a small world where his limbs could not move, where his voice seemed to be a distant echo. He could not swim anymore. He could not walk. The ocean that once sang to him now sounded like a distant thunder. Evelyn visited every day, bringing books, music, and the warmth of her presence. She brought a little plastic cup of lemonade that smelled like the first spring after a harsh winter. She whispered stories about how the tide came in, and how it left behind a glimmer of possibility. "You'll be okay," she said, her voice steady. She would sit beside him and read out loud, her voice a steady anchor in the tumult of pain. The books were the bridge between him and a world that had no sense of being too small for his heart. The doctors gave them a grim outlook. They told him he might never walk again, that the spinal cord had been damaged beyond repair. They suggested surgery, but it was a gamble that might not guarantee recovery. They told him the road ahead would be long, the future uncertain. Evelyn would listen, but she had an iron resolve. She would not let him think of the words that would have no meaning. They started to make a plan. The first step was to rebuild his body. The second was to rebuild his life. The third was to rebuild something more, a shared future. They went to a specialized rehabilitation center, a place that seemed to stand in quiet solidarity with their hope. The place was cold at first, the white walls a stark reminder that the world had shifted. They met a physiotherapist, a gentle woman named Mara, who introduced them to a world of exercises that seemed absurd at first. They were given a crutch, a brace, a small piece of the world that could not move but could be used. For Liam, it was a strange new language. The crutches were a constant reminder of his lost mobility, and the brace was a second pair of limbs. For Evelyn, it was a new responsibility. She was no longer a visitor, she became a guide, a co-conspirator, a partner in this arduous journey. The first day of the program, Liam was skeptical. The exercises felt ridiculous, almost as if they were a joke. He felt a sense of humiliation. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "One step at a time." Her words were a promise, not a threat. With time, the crutches became an extension of his limbs. The exercises, once awkward, began to feel natural. He could lift his right arm, and with Evelyn's help, move his left arm a little higher. He could feel the subtle change in his body. He could stand, if only for a few seconds, and look up at the sky that had always been a promise. He could hear the ocean call, and it was no longer distant, it was his daily reminder of resilience. Chapter 4: The Battle of the Mind. Physical recovery is a battle, but the mind often fights harder. Liam's sense of self, his identity, was shattered by the accident. He used to be a man who swam for hours, who walked by the pier and never had a care. The accident had turned him into a man who could not hold a simple conversation, whose body seemed to betray him. He felt anger and frustration, a sense of being cheated. The nights were filled with nightmares. He woke up gasping, the memory of the accident and the silence of the ocean that once sang to him. Evelyn was always there, with a blanket, a light on the other side of the darkness. She would say, "You are not alone. We're here together." One night, she held him in the dark, her breath on his cheek. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "We're going to rewrite this story." Her words were simple, but they were a promise. In the early mornings, the light would creep over his bed, a gentle reminder that the day had not ended. He began to write letters, in a journal that he kept on his chest. The words were messy at first, a swirl of feelings. The words flowed as he realized that writing might be the only way to heal. He wrote about the accident, about the fear, the hope, and the love. Evelyn read those letters aloud, her voice soft, and sometimes he would feel the words travel up his throat, echoing through the hollow of his chest. "Write what you feel," she would say. "Let the words shape the story. The story is yours to live, even if the world does not fit your expectations." He wrote about the time they walked on the pier, how the wind smelled like salt and hope. He wrote about the feeling of crutches, how the world felt strange, how his heart thumped like a drum in the silence. He wrote about the feeling of being seen by Evelyn, and how she saw him as a partner, not a patient. He began to see that the accident had not taken away his life, it had changed it. It had forced him to see the world through a different lens. He had to adapt, to find new ways to swim in the sea of life. Evelyn, too, faced her own battles. She had once been a bright, young teacher, full of enthusiasm. The accident had not just taken a man's ability, it had taken the light from her world. She had to rebuild her sense of purpose. She realized she could not let her fear dictate her life. She decided to channel her energy into helping others. She became a volunteer at the rehabilitation center, teaching new patients about the importance of hope. She found that by giving, she was receiving. They both realized that the battle was not just about recovery, it was about building a new life, one that would be more robust than the one that had been taken. They both had to accept that some things would never return, but they could create new meanings, new possibilities. Chapter 5. The Reawakening. Months passed. Liam's back began to heal, and he started to walk again. The crutches were not gone yet, but he could stand without them. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, and the feeling was intoxicating. He felt the world as a partner, the sea as an old friend. He could feel the wind on his face again, and it seemed to say, "You are back." Evelyn's heart was strong, and she was now not only a companion but a co-creator. She had taken the initiative to start a small organization, the Lighthouse, a support group for those who had experienced trauma. The group's motto was, "After the silence, there is light." They met in the same pier where they had first met, a place that had seen their story unfold. On a bright summer day, Liam and Evelyn stood together in the same old pier. They looked at the horizon, the sky a brilliant blue. Liam lifted his hand to touch the water, feeling the gentle waves. Evelyn placed her hand on his wrist, and together they smiled. "You know," Liam said, "the ocean is so vast. But I've learned that there are currents, little pockets that pull me forward." He smiled, "And you are my current. Together, we can navigate any tide." Evelyn looked at Liam, her eyes reflecting the sea. "We're not alone anymore," she said. "We have the courage, and we have each other." They walked along the pier, hand in hand. The wind carried the salty scent, and the world seemed to breathe. They had become the lighthouse of their own lives, and the world had given them a new purpose. Chapter 6. A life rebuilt. Years later, they were still together, but the story was no longer about survival alone. It was about building something from the remnants of their past. They had a small apartment above the pier, filled with books, plants, and a tiny painting of a lighthouse. The place was a home, not a hospital, not a clinic, but a place of love. Liam would sometimes sit at the window, watching the tide. He would think about the day he had met Evelyn, the day of the accident, and how his life had changed. He realized that the sea was not only a place of fear, it was also a place of freedom. He realized that the sea was a metaphor for life, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. Evelyn would walk through their apartment, humming a tune. She had a new sense of purpose. She had written a book about their journey, about the hope that had come after the silence. The book was a memoir that she had called After the Silence, The Light Within. The book had touched the hearts of many, inspiring those who had suffered similar fates to find hope in their own lives. They had become teachers to others, not in classrooms but in life. They would share their story at events, at hospitals, at the pier where their story began. They taught that the sea of life had currents that could be used. That one could create a lighthouse that would guide others. Chapter 7, the final lesson, the last chapter of their story, came not with a grand finale, but with a quiet lesson. They had built a life after a pivotal event, a life that had been shaped by pain, but also by love. Their story was a testament to the human spirit. They learned that hope is not an emotion, it is a decision. Even in the darkest hour, choosing to believe in a better tomorrow can make all the difference. Support is not a comfort, it is a partnership. The love between them was a mirror that reflected each other's strengths and allowed them to heal together. Recovery is a process, not a destination. Each small step, each new skill, each new hope was a piece of the larger picture. Resilience is a choice. Choosing to face the future with courage, to accept new limitations, to create new meaning is what defines resilience. The final image is simple. Two people, standing on a pier, the ocean as far as the eye can see, the sun setting behind them, casting a golden hue over the water. Their hands are intertwined, and they look toward the horizon with hope. They had survived, but they had also thrived. The sea had called them once, and they had answered. The future, once uncertain, was now bright, and their lives were proof that after the silence, there is always light.